My name is Janemary Ruhundwa. I'm a lawyer and advocate of the High Court, but I'm also the co-founder of Dignity Kwanza and the executive director of Dignity Kwanza. Dignity Kwanza is a Tanzanian non-governmental organization working to safeguard and promote human dignity of people affected by displacement for the attainment of their economic and social development. In a nutshell, Dignity Kwanza envisions Tanzania where everyone, including people affected by displacement, has an opportunity to attain their self-fulfillment and contribute to the nation building. And to achieve that, the Dignity Kwanza employs an integrated approach which combines legal aid, community empowerment, and advocacy to attain its objectives. And it's worth noting that Dignity Kwanza is the only NGO that has actively and consistently been engaging in advocacy for the rights of displaced populations in Tanzania. Before giving a quick overview of the involvement of the civil society organizations or CSOs in refugee protection in Tanzania, it's worth noting a few things. One is that Tanzania has been hosting refugees for over 6 decades. Started hosting refugees even before its independence and before its union with union of Tanganyika and Zanzibar to form Tanzania. Another thing that is important to note is that throughout these 6 decades or more, Tanzania has been receiving refugees in different phases. So the refugees who came in 1959, 1960s, the refugees who came in 1970s from Burundi, and then the 3 influx of refugees from Congo, Burundi, and Rwanda that came in 1990s. And then there was another wave of refugees that came in 2015. So it is also important noting this because it also informs the involvement of CSOs. But another important thing to note is that CSOs or civil society organizations have not been a common phenomenon before 1990s, country-wise. So that also informs, or that explains the fact that before 1990s, there weren't so many CSOs involved in refugee protection in the country. So coming back to the question and looking at all those 3 factors that I mentioned, the active involvement of CSOs in refugee protection in the country started being seen in 1990s. Before 1990s, the only CSO that is remembered to actively participate in refugee protection or offering services to refugee programs is Tanganyika Christian Refugee Services. So even by looking at the name, the organization was established even before the union. So it started operating from around 1964, and that was even before UNHCR came in the country to start supporting the government. So come 1990s, after the influx, there was a very little notable increase of CSOs in refugee responses. This time we still had TCRS, but there was also Caritas that came into play, and Tanzanian Red Cross, which is quasi-CSO because it's also partly a government entity as it is established by the Act of Parliament. So these are like the few other organizations that came into play in 1990s. Come to 2000, there's a little more increase again in the number, in terms of number of CSOs that were engaged. It's around this time where we see organizations like TWESA, organizations like NOLA, and later WILAC, Dignity Kwanza, that came into play. But generally speaking, the involvement of CSOs in refugee response is not as big as one would expect, even at the moment. I mentioned a significant increase of CSO involvement in towards the late 2000s. And this is informed by, first of all, the fact that there was generally there was an increase in CSOs in the country working in different areas. So clearly that would also mean an increase in the involvement of CSOs in refugee response. But also the needs, change of needs also informs that increase, because at this time there are certain needs that started emerging that would effectively be met through engagement of CSOs. You know, initially when refugees arrive, the focus is on the life-saving needs and very basic needs like health, food distribution. But later, when refugee stays longer, the interaction with host community call for legal education and legal assistance, because clearly those interactions would bring about some conflicts that would need some legal intervention. So around 2000, because refugees then had been in the country for, even those who came in 1990s who stayed in camps, had been in the country for over a decade and a half or so. So that's when need for legal assistance came up. But also there was sort of fatigue on the part of the government, which called for many restrictions or shrinking space, and this called for advocacy, and advocacy is also best done by local organizations. So these are some of the factors that inform the increase of CSOs in late 2000. So CSOs that are engaged in refugee response have been engaged in different areas. The decision to engage in one area and not the other is most of the time informed by the needs at that particular time, but also it is informed by the policies of the government as to what is allowed, what can be done and what cannot be done. It is also informed by the capacity of the CSOs, in particular funding to implement projects. So in the beginning, in 1990s, as I mentioned earlier, the needs were more into in life-saving services. And we see organizations during that time engaging in food distribution. I mentioned Tanzanian Red Cross engaging in health, shelter, camp management in general, shelter, water sanitation and health, and also education. So that was like primary areas in 1990s. I'm not going back, I'm not going beyond 1990s or below 1990s, because as I said, at that time we had only TCRS. And again, TCRS was engaging in basic services and basic needs, supporting the host community. But they're also engaging in supporting their livelihoods, their engagement in livelihoods. But come 2000, as I mentioned earlier, we see an increased need of legal assistance, legal information. We see an increased need in promoting livelihood activities. We see an increasing need of advocating for more favorable policies for refugees. And this is when we see also CSOs engaging in those areas. So we're seeing CSOs engaging in legal aid or legal assistance, legal information. We see CSOs engaging in livelihoods, promoting livelihoods activities in the camps. We see CSOs like Dignity Kwanza engaging in awareness raising about refugees, capacity building for government officials, but also engaging in advocacy in general. And as I mentioned earlier, policies and needs also determine. Tanzania implements an encampment policy. So we see many CSOs implementing or offering services in camps vis-a-vis villages and urban areas. It doesn't mean that there are no needs in those areas, but the focus is more on the camp because that's where the eyes of the government is on. So that's why you would see even these organizations that I mentioned earlier. Most of them are in refugee camps and very few are in urban areas because according to government policies or according to the government, there are no refugees in urban areas. So that's the areas that CSOs engage in. Areas in terms of the type of services, but also areas in terms of locations. The current state of relations between CSOs operating in refugee operations and the government is an interesting one because on the one hand, the government wants more CSOs to be engaged in refugee operations, more in terms of numbers. But on the other hand, the government is kind of restrictive in terms of what CSOs can do. For example, currently the government priority is on repatriation of refugees, in particular Burundian refugees. And if a CSO wants to implement a project that promotes self-reliance, the government is likely not to allow it to do that because it is interpreted as self-reliance would encourage refugees to remain in the country rather than repatriating. That's the kind of relations that exist currently. So it's as I said before, an interesting one. Although there aren't so many CSOs in refugee operations, but they have made notable contributions in that field. So apart from the normal service provisions in camps, significant contribution of CSOs has been in raising awareness about refugees and their realities to the general public. If I give an example of the work of Dignity Kwanza, my organization, it has been engaging with the general public, but also media into promoting balanced narrative of refugees in the country. And this is critical in changing perception of refugees because positive perception means more acceptability and smooth inclusion of refugees. So that is one area. But another area is in legal assistance. I mentioned earlier that there has been increasing need for legal assistance and legal information for refugees because of their long stay in the country, that it is very important for them to understand the legal terrain in the country, to understand the laws that impact their relations, but also to get legal assistance as a right of everyone in the country when they get into conflict with the law. And that has been done by CSOs. Although it might not be noticed, but CSOs have also made a huge contribution into pooling resources. Because, for example, Dignity Kwanza as an operational partner is not receiving money that comes to UNHCR. So by getting funding from other sources, and in most cases we get funding from the not so traditional funders of refugee operations. So we are increasing in the general funding that goes to refugee operations. So these are some few examples, but the most important contribution is in the area of advocacy. As I said, the concentration of many organizations is in ensuring refugees get food, get health services, get education, but not many engage in advocacy. And as a national organization, Dignity Kwanza has been doing this, so this is also a notable contribution that I can mention. One of the importance of engaging or allowing CSOs, or making it possible for CSOs to engage in refugee operations, is the fact that they are the first responders before INGOs or international NGOs have come in the country to respond, but also they are the last responders when international NGOs leave. Despite the good work that CSOs is trying to do, they face a number of challenges. There are many challenges they're facing, but they can be reduced to 2 or 3. One is operational challenge, and this is due to the fact that the refugee protection is taken to be a sensitive issue. To be specific, is looked at as a security issue, which CSOs do not have expertise on, and that means their intervention is very much restricted because of that sensitivity. And that would also explain why we don't have so many CSOs even now in refugee operations. So that has been one of the challenges. It's an area that needs intervention, but the intervention is so much controlled because of the securitization of the whole refugee protection issue. The second challenge is funding, or I would say capacity, but then I will reduce it to funding, because other aspects of capacity are all tied to funding. So CSOs face huge challenge in getting enough funds to implement their projects, and this affects their implementation of their programs. It affects their ability to attract and retain highly qualified staff to implement those projects. it affects the ability to access more fund, because when you don't have, for example, good fundraising team, then you're not able to your ability to get funding is also limited. So because of that, you see the sustainability of CSOs also affected, because they get funding just for small projects, which is not sustainable. They cannot retain highly qualified staff, so they are reduced to training centers where they receive fresh graduates who can accept a minimum salary or can also work on voluntary basis. They train them, they get experience, and then they are taken by they're taken by international organizations and UN agencies. So it's a cycle of poverty, cycle of not having capacity, but it's all centered around the challenges, the funding challenges. The government of Tanzania is very supportive of CSOs in the area of accessing funds. The government want CSOs to get more funds, because, as I said earlier, they want more CSOs to be involved in the operations. So the government is supportive when it comes to CSOs getting funds. They are not hesitant, even where you need some reference. They are open to offering that, as long as it's in line with the areas of operation they want CSOs to be engaged in. Unfortunately, governments as government do not offer funding to CSOs in this refugee operation. But where donors come in, government support the idea of funding local organizations. My suggestion or advice to policymakers in relation to regarding the most applicable framework of working with CSOs. Before I go to the framework, I would like policymakers to look at CSOs as a friend, as an unnecessary actor in the ecosystem, as an ally, because CSOs have a good understanding of the local context. They also understand the needs, because of their agility, CSOs are able to get to the grassroots. They are able to reach the very people that they are serving. But also CSOs, because of engaging with INGOs, donor community for many years, they also understand how that other area or how that space is like. So CSOs are kind of an entity that brings a balance that is required in the refugee response. So in terms of a framework, I would suggest that the government should make it a condition to have CSOs in the operation, no matter what. Because at the moment, involvement of CSOs is only dependent on the availability of funding. Although I said we have many CSOs engaged in the refugee protection now vis-a-vis before 1990s, but the number has gone down in the recent two or 3 years. And this is because of the funding question, and it's not a secret that the fund is not enough. The fund that UNHCR is receiving is not enough, and now the UNHCR looks for implementing partners that are able bringing in a significant contribution in terms of fundings. And because of this requirement, and as I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges that that CSOs have is funding. Very few CSOs were able to demonstrate ability to contribute, and many CSOs were left out. But thinking that the government could make a condition that no matter what, there should be areas where local actors should be supported to implement. So, for example, I'm thinking of government making it a condition that for an international organization to implement projects in refugee camps, for example, they have to have a local partner. Or for every dollar that is coming in for refugee operations, 30 or a certain percent must go through local partners. So those are the frameworks that government could put in place to ensure that local NGOs are still able to participate, but also I think the framework would go even as far as putting a percentage of core costs that donors should provide for local organizations, because currently core costs or admin costs, the percent is 4, while for international the percent is 7, and to explain this difference, why CSOs are in an endless cycle of poverty, and they are not sustainable because they are not getting enough admin costs share. So this is something that the government could intervene on.